More cracks begin to show as the state nears the end of its third month without a budget. We'll talk about it next on CapitolView. Welcome to CapitolView, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and WUIS, and with me today is Hannah Meisel with WILL Public Radio out of Urbana. Hannah, glad you're here in Springfield today.
Thanks for having me.
And Kent Redfield, retired professor of political science from the University of Illinois at Springfield. Kent, glad you're back.
Good to be here.
So at the top of the show, I just want to touch on some pretty sad news in Illinois state government. A sitting representative has passed away since the last airing of the show. Hannah, will you tell us a little bit about Representative Golar and what her issues were, and a little bit about what's going on with the news there?
Sure. Democratic Representative Esther Golar out of Chicago suddenly, well, I guess not so suddenly, but suddenly for the public, passed away on Monday morning. She had been ill for a little bit of time with, I believe, cancer, and she had suffered pretty silently. It wasn't very public, and of course in the last month she was in headlines because she had come to the Capitol, even though she was very, very sick, for that attempt to override the governor's veto on the labor arbitration bill earlier this month. And she had to, she made it to the floor, she made it for the vote, and then she had to be wheeled off to the hospital in Springfield because she was just so ill and so weak. And of course, that override ended up failing because there was one legislator, a fellow Democrat from Chicago, who didn't show up for the vote. And so that was the headline, the contrast between Representative Ken Duncan not showing up and Esther Golar being in so much pain but coming to Springfield.
And of course, even with that news, folks were a bit shocked. I think people maybe didn't quite realize how ill she was. Professor Redfield, she was known for focusing on social service issues and public health. What are folks remembering about Representative Golar this week?
Both her passion for her issues, certainly, and that she was a representative who looked after issues that affected the less fortunate and the people in need, but also, universally, people thought of her as a quiet, strong voice that was just regarded, one of the really good people at the State House, and in a process that sometimes doesn't seem to have enough good people. And so I think that a lot of people were, even though I think people close to her had a sense that her health was really, really, really bad, that a lot of people, it really does shock you when somebody that just seems to be a solid part of keeping things together is suddenly gone.
And like you said, we didn't hear from her all that much, but when you did hear from her, she tended to sing on the House floor, which was a fun, light moment. She had been very involved in the civil rights era, so she would adapt civil rights songs to whatever was going on at the time in the legislature. So she will be remembered for all of her, her social justice issues, but also for her presence on the House floor. Quiet, but just her.
And in the House this week, members did remember Representative Golar and Representative Duncan, who we just mentioned. Her district mate did get up and speak a little bit about remembering her singing voice and traveling with her and listening to her sing. So some nice memories there. I'd like to move on to some of the news that's coming out about the lack of a state budget over the last week or so. We're seeing just these sort of incremental news stories about programs shutting down and other effects, given that we're in the almost end of the third month without a state budget. Professor Redfield, what are we hearing this week? Some things from higher ed, some concerns there. MAP grants are coming up a lot.
Yeah, certainly in terms of financial aid for students, universities have essentially said, in terms of figuring your financial aid, we'll craft these packages so that it is as if we had the money, and but the university still has no budget. The university systems have no budget, and so if in fact they were not to get funded, then the university would have to absorb that, or you would suddenly have people in positions to pay back money that they didn't have. That's why they qualified for a MAP grant. And so it's the pressure on the students in terms of financial aid, and the university has no budget at all, and so they are carrying employees and carrying operating expenses basically out of their reserves. They certainly have tuition income, but to go beyond the end of the calendar year, even for the University of Illinois, would be very, very difficult if we don't get some resolution. And how that would translate into, certainly furloughs, but, could you have certain schools frankly not be able to open for the spring semester? We're certainly not there yet, but this is the one area that is not funded at all in terms of the state budget. We're about 90% is just rolling along with last year's spending and this year's revenue, which is, of course, is another issue. And so we're really starting to see how this is going to impact not only the institutions, but the students themselves.
And the state treasurer has been traveling around calling for some resolution to the MAP grant situation. Hannah, do you feel like there is some urgency building when it comes to this MAP grant situation, especially given that a lot of students have already kind of, that money's been spent, but it's not certain that it's going to come through at this point?
I think especially for students who are going to some of the regional state universities that have they're struggling, big university like the University of Illinois, they have plenty of reserves. They're going to be fine for a while. But one Eastern Illinois University, it's been sounding the alarm for a year now. It's not doing well, and that has a lot of students who are depending on these MAP grants, who are from lower income backgrounds, who they are very, very worried if they're going to have to drop out of school, if they're going to have to get a second job, because a lot of students already have a first job. And, a lot of these regional state universities, they are at least partially in a Republican district. And so while Republicans, we're not really sure who is wearing the jacket in all this yet. It, remains a volleyball game day to day. But the representatives who are in these districts, the representatives who, a lot of these students are from, especially up in the Chicago area, they're going to be feeling it. And it's not a pretty picture when you think of higher educational as trying to be the great equalizer. Well, it's not here in Illinois because we can't get a budget together.
And this is one of those things that parents and students would call their representatives about if they had concerns. Professor Redfield, we are hearing some university presidents, raising some alarms. But do you think we'll reach a point where the universities may be putting even more pressure on the legislature to get something accomplished here? It doesn't seem like they're really loading on the pressure yet.
Well, it's a matter of if we go another month with no end in sight, I think the landscape will change pretty dramatically. And it's the sort of thing that not only are you talking about trying to, the university talking about itself as an institution and its ability to serve students, but if you start to have furloughs, you start to lose faculty. It makes it, if you're not sure that you're going to get paid, you're not sure your health insurance claims are going to get paid, makes it a lot easier to take that job somewhere else. And so the problem with these kinds of situations is you tend to lose the best people. And when you start talking about disrupting programs, disrupting schedules, then there are lots of people who are planning to graduate in the spring and are looking for jobs and the next step in terms of their careers. And if they're back home rather than where their parents were anticipating getting them out of the house and off the budget, and suddenly they're back home, it's not the same kind of pressure as if having the K through 12 children home, but it's certainly going to build. But again, if you don't have children in school, in college, then you don't see this. If you don't need social services, you don't see this. We just, but certainly because you don't have an operating budget, then even agencies where we're paying employees are starting to feel the pressure. There was a story today in the Journal-Register about vendors not being willing to continue to carry some of the veterans' homes that the state runs in terms of providing, food and services. And so it's not just a matter of paying the employees. They have to have money in order to and resources in order to do their job and provide the services. So this is a house of cards but it's falling very slowly. It may collapse all at once. At the moment, it just seems to be, a little bit here and a little bit there.
Well, and that seems to be something that's maybe taken a little for granted in the fact that state employees are getting paid, but all these agencies, as you said, need to keep the lights on. DOC needs to feed prisoners, that kind of thing, all the goods and services that they use. It seems like some of the vendors are no longer willing to carry the state because the state was giving them back pay from last fiscal year, but now that's running out. Are we going to hit a wall here where 2015 appropriations are gone and vendors start to feel like, I don't want to wait for 2016?
Yeah, I think we're hitting that wall from the vendor standpoint. We're also hitting that wall in terms of the cash flow, because we're spending money at a clip that is, last year's budget, this year's revenue, at least a $4 or $5 billion gap. The comptroller has talked about being up to $8.5 billion in unpaid bills by the end of the year. And you have to go back and undo all of that before you can move forward. So we dig ourselves deeper in a hole every day.
Well, and another area that is related to this is the employee health coverage. The state announced a few weeks ago that it would not be able to pay vendors for employee health coverage for the same reason, because the FY appropriations have run out. The state feels it doesn't have the authority to pay for that in this fiscal year. Hannah, this came as kind of a shock, and just as a disclaimer, I think this applies to all of us being university employees or former university employees, but this came to a shock to employees and AFSCME, which represents a lot of the folks covered by this. What's AFSCME doing? How's it responding to this?
AFSCME has sued the governor's office to make sure that these health, at least for the time being, you can kind of be in this gray freeze of, there's ongoing legal action, because they don't want their, the state employees to have to, go into the dentist and then all of a sudden you thought a procedure that would be very simple. You would just have to pay, the small copay. All of a sudden you're paying all of it. That would be very, very bad. And this affects about 150,000 state employees. And, it's not a huge number, but it's a pretty big number. It's the size of a, mid-sized city. And so that's just another ongoing legal battle between labor and the governor's office. And then that can escalate into a lot of other areas. AFSCME is also AFSCME is also suing the governor's office because there were planned union layoffs, and so the governor's office announced recently that they would hold off on those. So it's interesting that they seem to not be willing to go through with that because there's this ongoing legal action. But we've yet to see what will happen with this employee health care.
Yeah, and you mentioned the lawsuit for union employees. The governor was laying off, I believe it was a few hundred, around 100 union employees. And the union sued. Now the governor has said, well, we'll hold off and see what the court decides. Professor Redfield, this is kind of getting us into a lot of legal territory, not having a state budget. It seems like judges are heavily involved in Illinois government, maybe more so than they have been in recent years.
Yeah, it didn't seem like a good idea to have the legislature run state government like it did when Blagojevich was governor and part of the time when Quinn was governor. It does not appear to be good policy overall to have the courts run Illinois state government, and so more and more of the budget is out of the hands of the policymakers, and until you get a hold of that and cut spending and increase revenue to start to match things up, then the judge has, there's a consent decree having to do with providing services to a particular population, usually involves some federal money. And their concern is that the state meet the consent decree. They don't have to. The court doesn't have to balance the budget. The court doesn't have to worry about bond ratings, all of those things. And so, and you've got a variety of different kinds of legal situations that you're in. And so, if we were in fact to pass a budget, there's a bill floating around they're trying to pass that would essentially fund a lot of what's left on human services. Pretty much all that's left after that is healthcare and higher ed. And at that point, you may just throw up your hands, get a little bit temporary tax increase and just write the whole fiscal year off, but at a tremendous cost in terms of the damage that you will have done to providing services. And the investment firms, the bond houses, have no faith in the state as it is, and this kind of behavior just is going to reinforce that. I mean, I expect we will get, if this is not resolved by the end of the month, we'll get a downgrade, and it's individual lives. I mean, we're not going to lay off the people at the State Museum that are involved that have union coverage, but does that mean we're still going to close it or not close it? And so the uncertainty in terms of people's lives is just is very, very difficult.
Well, and that budget bill that you mentioned passed in a House committee this week. It's been through the Senate. Unlikely, we don't know at this point if it may go through the House this afternoon, but it seems pretty unlikely because there are folks that aren't in town, so the votes wouldn't be there for it. But of course, there's no revenue to back up that spending. So Hannah, these votes that we're taking to kind of reinstate things, are they really getting us anywhere?
They're really not. This bill that we're talking about, it's Senate Bill 2046. It's about $4 billion in everything that the things that we traditionally talk about falling through the cracks. So early intervention programs, autism programs, respite care, services for the developmentally disabled, homelessness prevention, emergency food programs, addiction treatment, mental health. The list goes on. And and the lottery, because we also have lottery winners who are not being sued, and there's an ongoing lawsuit there. But if we don't have, the revenue to back up the authority to spend, because remember, every time the legislature votes, it's only for the authority. The revenue, that's not under their control. It's under the control of us taxpayers who, we earn the money and it gets sent to the state. Anyway, the votes, even if they did approve this, it's just going to be an even, like we have talked about, in the comptroller sounding the alarm on the bill backlog growing and growing, because we fundamentally have this huge gap between the revenue that the state is bringing in and the amount of money that we are spending, because we are not taking a good look at, cuts and revenue together. So we are just spending at FY15 appropriations, and we are not, because we had a cutback in the amount of income tax we're taking in, it's just going to grow larger and larger, and the bond rating agencies are going to weigh in, and it's going to come to a head once we finally are willing to bite the bullet, and it's going to be very bad.
Or we run out of cash.
We run out of cash. That's also a distinct possibility. The comptroller's computers, they write the checks overnight, and a combination of technology not necessarily catching up to what is reality now, but there is a time that it's gonna say we have $0 left, and whatever check that you're in the middle of writing, you can't, and the vendors aren't gonna get paid. Anything that isn't, that has even been covered by consent decree or court order or even existing legislation, it's all gonna stop.
Yeah, and there is a definite pecking order. I mean, the first claim is to people the state owes that we've borrowed from in terms of bonds, and bondholders have a first claim. Pensions are one of those things that is very high at the list there. And if you have various court orders, then maybe you get a little closer to the front of the line. But if you fund, pass an appropriation for the kinds of programs we're talking about here, which are basically discretionary state spending. The state does it because they think it's a good thing to do. There's no federal money involved. There's no legal obligations in terms of like pensions or bonds. And so, if there's no money, there's no money. I mean, the state always has money coming in, and we're going to be able to meet, the people that are at the top of the list are going to continue to get paid. We're not going to run out of money in terms of that. But the time that it takes to get to the people at the bottom of the pecking order gets greater and greater and greater. And so, this really is unsustainable.
Well, while we're on this bleak clip, let's talk a little bit about Chicago. Mayor Rahm Emanuel presented the city's budget this week, and he is calling for a property tax increase. Professor Redfield, what's going on? Why does the mayor feel that this new revenue is needed?
Well, because they have debt and pension obligations that they cannot meet. And so they need an infusion of revenue just to basically keep things going. And because they have danced around, they haven't raised taxes in forever. They have gone through all kinds of budget things to put off paying for things, or to come up with revenue. But now they have. I mean, it's not just property taxes. It's a garbage collection tax. It's a whole variety of things, and that they're looking for revenue. It still will not be enough. They need help from the state, particularly in relation to the Chicago schools. And the governor has been very adamant about leveraging his position. The mayor would like to have an exemption in the property tax increase that he's asking for to go to certain residential homeowners, which would require change in state law. The governor essentially said, don't look for help until you make your Chicago more competitive and business friendly, which is code for pass the turnaround agenda, or help me pass the turnaround agenda. And so, Chicago's doing what they can, and this is going to be a very tough budget and a very tough set of decisions to get more revenue. But it's not, it's not going to be something that even if they get all of what the mayor wants, it just puts off, what needs to be a much broader solution of not only, of dealing with Chicago in the context and Chicago schools in context of the rest of state government. And so you can't fix one piece of this. It's too interdependent.
Well, and the mayor did not come to Springfield this week, but a deputy mayor did come to talk to a legislative committee a little bit about that property tax increase and the exemptions that they would like to put in that they say would protect some more low-income homeowners. The mayor's only come to Springfield a few times asking for things, and he's kind of had a mixed bag of success and not success there. Hannah, how is the legislature kind of receiving some of this stuff in these early stages?
The price tag on what Rahm Emanuel wants, the almost $600 million dollar property tax increase, that is really big, and especially for Chicago legislators, they're torn. As for the homestead exemption that Rahm Emanuel is seeking, it would be for people whose homes are worth less than $250,000. The speaker has signed off on that pretty much, but the governor, again, he is not okay with that, and it's going to be tough. Things that the mayor wants, I guess like $10 a month for trash pickup. That's something that's I don't want to say never been done before, but that seems extreme to people who have not, gone through this before. And so it's going to be really tough. One thing I do want to mention is that when we talk about Illinois, we say, oh gosh, Illinois' finances are in ruin. Well, Chicago's are much worse. Chicago's bonds are actually at junk status. Illinois' are still fine. Most of what the $600 million property tax raise will go to is police and fire pensions. It's not like the city will experience a whole host of new programs. It's all going to be going toward paying this huge backlog of pensions that they've put off for years and years and years.
And Professor, there's some cuts involved here too as well, right? It's not just looking for new revenues.
Oh, as far as the city budget is concerned, certainly. And they have the mayor made a point of show me it to all of the aldermen, give me the revenue ideas, give me the cuts, and no one is pretending that Chicago city government is 100% efficient, nor is state government 100% efficient. But there's only a certain, there's a basic level of services that you have to provide, and a city the size of Chicago has, major populations that need services from the city, and often in conjunction with the state. And so, there's poverty throughout Illinois, but the concentration of poverty there is something that needs to be addressed, and it's so there's only so much you can cut. And then, even though the mayor has won a second term, Mayor Emanuel, it's still kind of an ambiguous relationship. He was perceived as being very friendly and cozy with the candidate Rauner, and now they've clashed on a number of issues, and yet there are other parts of things like some school reform, and particularly charter schools, where if we ever get to education, would assume that the governor and the mayor would be perhaps more on the same page than lots of members in the Democratic caucus down here in Springfield. And so, it's not clear that how the mayor fits into the political dynamic.
Well, and I hate to cut you off, but we are going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Hannah and Kent, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues WUIS, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.